So what I will try to do in the next about 30 minutes is to give a bit of an overview on what COPs are and why they matter, and perhaps more importantly, how all of you can get involved. This is a bit of a challenge because COPs tend to be a pretty complex business, and 30 minutes is not a whole lot of time, so do not expect me to give you the full picture, but hopefully something that can provide a foundation for further discussions and questions and answers. Sorry, just a second. I hope you can see the slides, and if you can, you should see a picture of me in 1997. This was taken in Kyoto at the first COP I attended, which was COP3. And since then, I've attended, if I'm not mistaken, 19 COPs, so COP26 would be my 20th COP. So I've seen a couple of COPs over the years. I should explain that I have never served as a negotiator to the climate negotiations. So my experience is mostly from following and observing the negotiations and what happens at the COPs, rather than taking part in the actual intergovernmental negotiations. So I think that is important to bear in mind when I'll try to tell a bit about how the COPs work. I think it's helpful to understand the broader history of international climate negotiations, because that makes some of these things that tend to happen at COPs more understandable. So I'll just run through a few of the key events in my opinion. And I would like to start in 1992, which was the year when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was established. And why that is relevant is that the UNFCCC, as it is often called, is still in many ways the foundation of the international climate negotiations and the COPs. It is endorsed by almost all countries in the world, and what was quite important in the agreement was that it set this very broad objective to stop global heating to tolerable levels. It is framed in a slightly complicated way, but that's basically what it is saying. We need to stop global heating to avoid the worst impact. And it also included already the first emission commitments for countries. At the time, it only applied to countries in the global north, but it was a start. Now, in 1997, in Kyoto, the first COP I attended, a protocol was added under the UNFCCC, so the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what was particular about that treaty was that it, for the first time, included legally binding emission targets for countries of the global north. And it also included 3 different market mechanisms for trading emission rights between countries. And while the Kyoto Protocol itself is not particularly relevant these days anymore, because it has already been placed by the Paris Agreement, some of these features, some of the elements of the Kyoto Protocol have lived on in further treaties and negotiations. So I think that's why it may be helpful also for today's discussions. Then my third piece of this very short history of international climate negotiations would be from 2009. That was the time when COP15 took place in Copenhagen. And that was also the time the international community was supposed to come up with a new treaty that would cover the whole world and would kind of build on what was agreed earlier. It was supposed to be the Paris Agreement, but at the time, I guess it could have been the Copenhagen Agreement. The conference was largely considered a huge failure, and there were many reasons why it failed. But it was a failure, especially looking at it immediately after the conference ended. Now, looking back after some years, I think it's also fair to say that even though the COP15 in Copenhagen was unable to come up with a new international treaty, it did, however, produce some elements that we are actually still benefiting from today in the form of the Paris Agreement. So I think history books will treat COP15 slightly more kindly than when we did after we left the conference immediately after it in 2009. And then the fourth period, or the fourth point in time I would like to highlight here is, not surprisingly, from 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted at COP21 in Paris. And the Paris Agreement is a very interesting piece of text, and if you haven't done so already, I would very much recommend to read it in full. But just to highlight some of the key elements there, one was to establish this overarching goal to limit global heating to well below 2 degrees rather than just to 2 degrees, and to aim for 1.5 degrees if at all possible. The Paris Agreement also included this bottom-up process for countries to come up with their own national climate commitments that are called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions in the jargon that is used in the climate negotiations. And another important element was a decision to mobilize at least $100 billion a year in international climate finance to support climate activities in the global south. Now, the Paris Agreement is a really important piece of text. Also, the decisions, other decisions that were made in Paris. Likewise, I just wanted to highlight one element from the decisions made in Paris, which was that at the time, countries committed to, first of all, submitting their own national climate targets and commitments, but in addition to that, coming back to them in 5 years' time, that is in 2020, to see if they are still good enough, if we need to do something else, if we need to do something more. And that was, of course, supposed to happen last year because of the pandemic that did not take place. And now it is in Glasgow in COP26 that this kind of review of national commitments is going to take place. And that is very important, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, I understand that perhaps many people have been following climate negotiations already, might already have a decent understanding of what a COP is, but for the benefit of those perhaps that don't have that experience, I think it may be useful to unpack what a COP actually is. And kind of at face value, it is pretty simple. A COP is basically a conference of parties, and a conference of parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is the treaty that was adopted in 1992 already. And when we say parties, we actually mean countries, because the countries that have ratified the UN Framework Convention, they become parties to that convention. There's one little exception to this rule, which is the European Union. It is also a party as the Union, and not only the individual member countries, but mostly it's countries that are parties to the convention. The way I usually simply call it is that it's a UN climate conference, because that's what it basically is about. And usually they take place every year. And now when you hear COP26, it just means that it's the 26th of these conferences of parties. Sadly, it is not quite that simple, and there are many complicating factors. One is that when we talk about a COP, it is actually many meetings taking place at the same time. So the COP itself is the conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, i.e., it is the meeting where countries decide what to do under that treaty. However, the meeting also serves as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol and meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement. So we have these three different international climate agreements. They all have their different meetings for making decisions about those treaties and under those treaties. So in fact, it is three different meetings taking place in parallel and at the same time. In addition to that, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has these two subsidiary bodies. One focuses on science and technology, and the other one focuses on implementation, i.e. more policy relevant and policy related issues. And those two bodies also have their meetings taking place at these COPs. Now, this is not the end of it though, because in addition to all these meetings, there are meetings of other bodies that have been established under these international climate treaties. And they too take place during or before or after these COPs. And there's also this high-level political meeting gathering heads of states and heads of state and government from different parts of the world, called the World Leaders Summit. That is kind of in addition to or parallel to these official intergovernmental meetings. The way I usually like to frame this very complex network of meetings taking place under the umbrella of a COP is that there's essentially two different strands of meetings taking place. One is the official intergovernmental side, dealing with official business under these treaties and related to those treaties. And the other one is more like a, you could call it a climate fair or climate show or a climate get-together, climate party, if you will. Basically bringing all kinds of different stakeholders, experts, decision makers together to discuss important climate issues. And why I make this distinction between these two different parts of the COP is that while, of course, this intergovernmental part related to these official treaties, it is very important. In many cases, actually, you can achieve as much or even more on the more or less official side of the COPs, where different leaders from different parts of the society come together to discuss climate action. So it's basically this two-headed animal, and I think it's important to bear in mind these two different aspects of COPs. On a more practical note, those attending COPs will soon find out that access to different meetings and rooms depends on your status as a COP participant. And that is presented in the form of these badges. So everyone needs to carry a badge to get access to the official conference venue. And there are many different types of badges with different colors. But the main distinction is that if you have a pink badge, then you are part of an official government delegation. And then you have more access to many negotiating rooms and official settings under the COP. Many people join COPs as observers, so representing NGOs, for instance, and they might have more limited access to these official parts of the meeting, but they do also have access to many other events and also the more public-facing side of the negotiations. But your registration status, your badge, pretty much determines which are the parts of the COP you can access personally in the COP itself. I think it's also important to recognize how negotiations take place. I said earlier that when I say parties, in the Conference of Parties, it mostly means countries. But if you look at the negotiations at COPs, it is not so often that actually countries take the floor to present their views on different topics. In most cases, it is actually the different negotiating groups, and there are many, and one country can belong to many different negotiating groups. So for instance, one country could be a member of AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States. At the same time, it could also be a member of the Africa Group, and it could also be a member of the Least Developed Countries Group. And these different negotiating groups, by and large, lead the negotiations at COPs. Some of these are more formal, some are less formal. Some have been around for a really long time, some are more recent inventions, and then some are more, should I say, aspirational. So they don't take such an active role in the negotiations themselves, but can be important in terms of shaping the debate. For instance, the High Ambition Coalition doesn't really have a strong role in the negotiations, but bringing the more ambitious countries in terms of climate ambition together, it can also play an important part. Now, if this is basically what happens at COPs in general and their role in this international climate agreement architecture, what is specific and special about COP26? There are actually quite many things that make it stand out compared to the previous COPs. First, and quite obvious that it's the first one that is taking place right after the pandemic, or well, partly in the middle of the pandemic still, but towards the tail end, I hope, of the pandemic. Many of the practicalities will still be affected to a large extent by COVID rules. It is the most high-profile climate meeting, a climate COP, in a very long time. We already know that more than 120 heads of state and government will be attending the Leaders Summit in the first days of the COP. Like I said earlier, it is the time for countries to come back to their earlier national climate commitments and to have a serious look at whether those are still relevant, whether they are up to date and enough. And the kind of overarching reason why this COP is really important is that we are simply running out of time. We are running out of our carbon budget globally. We are running out of time to reduce emissions rapidly. And like the COP hosts in the UK have said, this might be the world's best last chance to limit global heating to tolerable levels. And you will all know, of course, that to limit global heating to tolerable levels, we basically need to cut global emissions in half every decade from now on until mid-century, when we are supposed to be carbon neutral already. And that, of course, is a tall order, and it requires massive changes. The good news is that in the past 1.5 years, we have seen a very significant shift, at least in the mindsets and in the broad long-term targets key countries have set. Different types of net zero targets aiming at net zero emissions, cover now about 3/4 of global emissions already. And the slides I'm showing here are sadly, or perhaps I should say, very positively already out of date, because just yesterday, Saudi Arabia announced that it is going to go for net zero by 2060. So there has been a lot of positive developments taking place, and those developments are taking place basically as we speak. But already a huge chunk of global emissions are covered by net zero targets. And these national climate commitments that countries were supposed to review and update in 2020, we now have new or updated national climate commitments for about 150 countries already. So most of the world's countries have done what they promised, and they have updated their national targets. We are still expecting some more, and you see in blue the countries that have not yet done so, that have not yet submitted their new or updated national climate targets, most notably China and India. And we will hopefully see new commitments coming from them. If that provides you an overview of which countries have submitted new or updated targets, I think it's also important to look a bit closer to what these targets contain and whether they are at all sufficient to face the climate crisis. And this is an interesting review that the Climate Action Tracker does and updates regularly. It only covers a subsection of world's countries, so not all countries are included, but it does cover all the biggest emitters. And here you can see that out of these countries that have been reviewed by the Climate Action Tracker, only the Gambia has actually commitments that are compatible with limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees. There are a couple of countries that are not too far. Most of these are coming from the global south, the UK being the only exception to this rule, presented here in yellow. Then we have quite many important players that have clearly insufficient goals and measures in place, and this includes both the EU and the USA, but also countries like Japan and South Africa. Then we have a varyingly long list of countries that have even more insufficient measures and targets, and this category includes, for instance, China, India, New Zealand, South Korea, and some others. And then finally, there is an even worse category, which includes countries like Russia or Saudi Arabia. I would just add that after yesterday's announcement, it might be that Saudi Arabia moves from this laggard list 1 or 2 steps higher. So even though we have updated national climate commitments from a large number of countries, sadly, most of these updated commitments are clearly not enough yet, and so many countries need to do more. At the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that we have made progress over the years. I've been involved so long that I still remember the times when countries' policies and targets were leading us to somewhere close to 3 degrees of global heating, even more. What we see today is that if countries really implement their current targets that they have submitted under the Paris Agreement, that would lead us to somewhere around 2.4 degrees of global heating. That is, of course, way too much, and that is not something we can accept, but it is still better than way more than 3 degrees. And if you factor in all these recent net zero targets, we might actually be heading to 2 degrees already. And this would, of course, be a really a good piece of news for the global climate. And of course, at the same time, we need to remember that we need to aim at 1.5, because that is the maximum we can take, especially in the most vulnerable countries and most vulnerable communities, in particular in the global south. So much needs to still happen, but much has already happened. So the activities have not been in vain. Regarding the issues on the table at COP26, apart from the overall ambition of these national climate commitments, there are some particular negotiating issues also on the agenda. I think one of the most prominent ones will be the rules for the market mechanism under the Paris Agreement. It is often referred to Article 6 because that is the article in the Paris Agreement that explains this market mechanism. Very important will be future target for international climate finance. In Paris, countries agreed that they would aim at $100 billion by 2020. But what happens in the future? How much more we need to mobilize international climate finance? That will have to be decided. There are also some other, perhaps to some extent, smaller issues on the table, and to some extent also more technical issues, but we can come back to those if those are of particular relevance. I would perhaps add that loss and damage is not a technical issue. It is a very important issue also politically, but on the COP26 agenda, it doesn't feature that prominently. Now, just to come to the end of this overview, how to get involved, I think there are some things that are good to remember, regardless of whether you will be able to join physically the COP or whether you want to join online. I think for those of us who are traveling to Glasgow, I would just simply highlight that it is good to take the official requirements seriously. This will be my 20th COP, and never ever has it been so complicated and difficult regarding different travel and health requirements. So please do have a close look at what is required by the authorities for you to attend. Learning the basics, I think, is kind of foundational to understanding what is happening. If you understand, at least on a kind of broad level, what is the climate architecture in these different international treaties, how COPs function, it will make your life much easier. It will make your work at COPs much more effective. The full agenda of all the issues that will be discussed either at the COP or kind of around it is so massive that no one can humanly cover it all. So I would very strongly encourage everyone to focus. What is the key issue that really matters to you the most? Is it adaptation to climate change? Is it ambition of national climate commitments? Is it perhaps indigenous peoples or gender equality? Is it international climate finance? I think it's good to focus on the issues that really are closest to your heart. Planning is good to do in advance rather than just appearing at the COP and then trying to do it ad hoc. It's always also a good opportunity to meet people, because there are so many people who feel passionate about climate action coming from all corners of the world to COPs. So it's a great opportunity to meet people. So it's good to let people know that you will be there as well, so that you can connect. And Glasgow in November, good to prepare for that also very concretely in terms of clothing. Now, if you will be at the COP itself, there's a couple of additional tips I would give, and one is to follow negotiations specifically from your perspective, and that can seem quite difficult to understand where these different negotiations take place. But if you invest a bit of time, I think you will be able to find out where to go and what items to follow. The COPs have a mind-bogglingly large number of different side events. It's definitely hundreds, if not thousands, of side events on all imaginable topics related to climate. And it's a great opportunity to learn from the world's best experts. It's also a great opportunity to network with people. So have a look at the different side events that are available. There will be demonstrations, and I think it's important to show force, to show up, to send the message to the leaders that we are demanding climate action. And especially for those of us who are privileged enough to attend the COPs, I think we kind of also have the duty to share our experiences with all the people who are interested in climate issues, but will not be able to join themselves. So actively communicating what happens at the COP, why it matters, and what people can do, how they can contribute to people back home, I think is also extremely important. Now, finally, I also included some useful resources in my experience that you can use in the run-up to the COP to prepare, to study and to learn better, and during the COP also to follow what happens in the negotiations, and these links will be available in the presentation. Now, this is where I would like to end. Thank you very much, and I hope this has been a useful overview of what happens at the international climate negotiations and at COPs.